For the final lesson in Module 2, I'm going to apply some of the best practice guidelines to find possible problems with the example project from Module 1, and then use the advanced techniques that we covered in this module to try and solve them. Like before, the point of this isn't necessarily that you follow along, although you can if you want. Instead, the idea is that if you feel like you're able to anticipate solutions to the problems that I'm going to pose in this lesson, then you'll be able to apply that same knowledge to writing your own scripts. So with that in mind, what problems do I need to solve? So basically, what I'm looking for are violations of the solid principles that could actually cause me some kind of problem if I wanted to make this project bigger. And by bigger, I mean more weapons, new features, just generally being able to change it easily. So for example, anytime a script is doing too much on its own, or tightly coupled systems that would be difficult to test, and structural approaches that might get in the way of adding more levels and more game modes and new things without having to completely rewrite how the game works. For each issue, I'm going to describe the problem I'm looking at, and what I'd like you to do is think about how you'd solve it for yourself. So let's get started. So if you don't remember this project from the first module, it's just a little game where you fly around and you can shoot asteroids and score points. And it's pretty simple and it works. It works fine. However, there are some things in here that I want to change that if I was thinking about how I was going to make the game bigger, I wouldn't have done in the first place. So what problems am I trying to solve? So the first problem, let me open it up, is the asteroid script. So the asteroid script, it does multiple things. For example, it holds a points value, it changes its size randomly, and it moves itself around, or at least it sets its motion when it's first created. Now, these are all things that are relevant to an asteroid, but they're not exclusive to an asteroid. They're not necessarily what an asteroid script would be doing. And actually, if you think about it, there's nothing in here that only an asteroid could do. There's stuff all over the place that I might want to put somewhere else. So I might want to give a different object that's not an asteroid points. I might want to make a different object that's not an asteroid change its size randomly, or have it float around. So all of this needs splitting out, really. So that's what I'm going to do first. Before I do that, I'm going to go to the prefab. And you'll see here, these at the moment, these are individual prefab objects. And what I'm just going to do is delete 2 of them and create 2 prefab variants. Because then when I make my changes to the first asteroid, they will be reflected on the others. Prefab variant, asteroid 3. Okay, so now I've got 3 asteroids. I'm going to change that to 2. And that to 3, so they should look correct now. And just so it continues to work, I'm just going to replace, because obviously I've broken the object pool references now, I'm just going to replace that. Okay, so we're back up and running. Now, what are we going to take out of this script first? Well, let's take out... We can actually make all of our scripts here and then open them and then move the logic across. So we're going to take out the random size element. So I want to create a random size script. I'm going to open that up. And I'm actually going to go back and make the other scripts as well now so that I can do this all just in Visual Studio. So what else do we need? We need points. Points was in the asteroid, so we want it to score points. And lastly, we want to give the asteroid floating movement. So I'm going to call it floating movement. Okay. Open that and open that. Right. So now everything's open, I can copy this stuff across. Okay, so we're going to do the random size one first. So I basically want to take the random size logic out of here. And the way I'm going to do that is I am just going to copy this whole thing, paste it in here. And I'm just going to delete anything that I know isn't relevant. So I don't need the rigid body or the points value. I do need the default scale. Don't need that, do need that. Don't need points, don't need anything to do with the rigid body. Don't need a position. Okay. And I don't actually need to set the scale in on disable, so I can take that out as well. And now I'm just going to make this a little more user-friendly since it's now a standalone system. So I'm just going to create a minimum scale. Of course, it's 0.5, so have it what it was before, and max scale of 1.5. Okay. And I'm just going to replace these. Min. Max. And that's all I need to do with that. So I can save that. I'm just going to take that logic out of here now. So I'll comment it out for now. So we'll comment out that, and that, and that, and that. Yeah. Okay, on to points. We can actually do a similar thing, where I'm just going to copy everything, paste it in. Don't need the rigid body, don't need anything that's commented. All that, don't need that. Points value do need, and don't need the rigid body. So again, with this, I'm just going to make it a little more user-friendly. So I'm going to add a serialized field, int base points equals 100. And call that base points. Now in the projectile script, that's looking for a damageable component. So that's going to cause a problem when we take this out of Asteroid. So if I do that now, I can follow the errors. So where's the error? Here it is. So we're just going to change that to points. Oop. Now this isn't how I'm going to have the point system work by the end of this lesson, but for now, it's not the problem I'm trying to solve, so I don't want to get too distracted. I want to stay focused on what I'm doing, which is taking taking logic out of the Asteroid class. So the next thing is I need to take this movement logic out. So looking pretty thin on the ground here, so I might delete some of this. Delete that. And all of this is relevant to the movement, which means that I now actually don't have anything left in the Asteroid class, which is fine. There's nothing that the asteroid does that is unique to being an asteroid. It is a floating object that can be damaged and has points, and that's it. So what I can do is I can actually go ahead and delete it from the project. What I'm going to do before I do that is take it off of the object because I don't want to cause any problems. And then it's gone. So I'm going to save, and I'm going to make sure that everything still works. but it works. Still scoring points. Objects are still moving. Still random size. All good. Okay, so what's next? So first problem solved. The asteroid no longer does multiple things. It now does nothing. It's gone. But we didn't need it. It's all right, because now we have asteroids that, if we go back to the prefab, we have asteroids that are damageable, they have a random size, they hold points, they move by floating, and if I wanted to take any of these characteristics off, instead of going into the asteroid script to edit it, I can just turn them off, or I can remove them. Nice and easy. And I can also reuse them on other objects. So what's next? Well, the next thing I want to address is I want to look at the player and I want to look at the movement script. Now, the movement script has a direct reference in it to the fire sprite, which is a bit weird if you think about it, because now a movement script must have a fire sprite. In this case, it's being null checked, so you could leave it blank, but that's not a very extendable thing. It's a bit odd to have this so directly embedded inside of a script that has nothing to do with technically the fire sprite. I know they are related systems, but you could make that argument about all sorts of stuff. So how do we go about fixing it? First, we need a way for the fire sprite to look after itself. So I'm going to create on the fire display a fade sprite script. I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to speed through this because this is just a script that is going to fade a sprite when I want it to. So I will explain it as I go, but it's not important to the relationship between the scripts, which is what I want to focus on. So I need a reference to a sprite renderer. It's going to be the sprite. I need a fade speed, let's say 5 units per second, and I need a Boolean value to automatically turn it off. This is because I'm going to use update to control this, but I don't want it running update all the time, and I don't want to use coroutines in this either. Just because it's not an easy way to do it. I want to do it in the easiest way possible. So I'm just going to have it constantly do it in update. And if it detects that it's not really doing anything, I'm just going to have it turn itself off. So to remind me of what this does, I'm going to put in a tooltip. Just to remind me of what this does, because I'm not sure how clear it would be. So when you hover over this Boolean, this tooltip will apply. You could also do it this way, but because it's such a long line, I prefer to do it like that. And then I'm going to have a private float that is the target that I want this sprite to move towards, the opacity at least. Now, need update. And in update, I'm going to do new value equals mathf move towards. So this will move steadily towards, it'll move a float value towards another float value at a defined rate, but without going over. That's what move towards is. You can do it with vector 3s as well. There's a vector 3 move towards. It's not eased or anything. It's just controllable by speed, changing a value towards another one. Super handy. and the existing target, the existing value is going to be the alpha channel of the color of the sprite. The target is going to be the target, and the max delta time, which is how much it can change in a frame, is going to be fade speed times time.delta time. So that turns it into a units per second, so it can change at a rate of 5 units per second. It's only a value between 0 and 1 anyway, but obviously that's faster than, say if it was 1, it would take a whole second to go between 0 and 1 and 1 and 0. Then I'm going to set the transparency here. I haven't written that function yet, so I'm just going to make a note of it. And then if auto off is enabled and the sprite color equals 0, then enabled equals false. So there are two ways to turn off an object. So you can turn off the component or you can turn off the object. Turning off the object would be game object.setActive, and then you can do true or false. Like that would turn it on. Enabled is the property of this component as to whether or not it's turned on or not. So you can turn it on or off. So now I'm going to write a function to actually change the transparency of the sprite. So that's what this is going to do. So this is going to be a private set transparency function, and it's going to take a float value. And the reason I'm going to put it in here, because I don't want to be writing out this more than once because it's a long line, is I want to set the sprite color to a new color, which is sprite.color.a. I'm going to do all the others as well. Not A, sorry, R. RGB. RGBA. RGB. And then for the last one, the value. So we're just actually changing the alpha channel, but there is no way to do just that. So now I can just call set transparency anytime I want to change the transparency of the sprite. So I can set transparency to new value. And if it ever gets turned off, I'm going to go ahead and set the transparency to 0. Okay. Why is that doing that? Oh, I can see what I've done here. I'm doing this all in update by accident. Okay, so if you notice, I've carried on writing functions, but I'm still actually in the update function. So I've put these in the wrong place. That's why they're acting weird. That's why onDisable isn't being used. There we go. Silly. Right, now where was I? Okay, so now I've got a way of changing the transparency, and I've got the logic that will do it. I want to provide some public functions for other scripts to interact with this, and all I really want them to be able to do is either set the transparency outright to something immediately or change the target. So I'm going to write those two functions now. So set sprite. Did I write that correctly? Transparency. Yep. So set sprite transparency value, float value, and then this is going to be, I'm going to check if auto off and enabled equals false, because then if it is, I'm going to turn it on. Enabled equals true. Then all I'm going to put here is set transparency value. Okay, so all this does is it sets the transparency as it is to a new value. This will change the target. Set sprite transparency target. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to replace this with target equals value, and that's it. That's the whole script. So not important to what we're doing here, but still useful. So I'm going to go back to the inspector. I'm going to connect the sprite renderer. I'm going to leave auto off on. And then I need a way of triggering this. Now, what I like to do for local connections, so this is a local connection because it's connecting this, where is it, movement script to this fire object. And this is where normally you might create a direct reference to it and just drag it in, and you might end up with something like this, which is kind of an issue because it makes it very unique. So I need a way of using this to trigger the fire script, but in an abstracted way. Here's how I'm going to do that. So I'm going to use a Unity event. So using Unity engine.events, and then at the bottom, because it takes up quite a big space, so I like to put these at the bottom. Serialized field, Unity event that takes a float. And I'm going to call it on thrust. And then when the movement function is called, I'm going to call the same. I'm going to call the onThrust Unity event. So onThrust dot invoke. Because this is a Unity event, not an event delegate, I don't need to check to see if it's null. That's not a check I need to make with Unity events. And I'm going to pass in the raw value dot get float, not the move axis, because I know the move axis can be more than one. I know the value will just be between 0 and 1. So now I have a Unity event that I can connect to something else. So I'm going to add an event, drag this to it, and I'm going to set fade sprite, set transparency target. So all this is going to do is it's going to try and fade out the whole time. Let's see if that works. It's working, but it's not holding on when I keep pressing up. So why is that? Oh, it's still fading out because I haven't taken the old script out. That was silly of me. Should read my notes. Okay, so I can take all of this logic out now, and it should work. It's just movement logic left now. So now when I test this, okay, there we go. That's better. And if I decide I don't want to have a fire display anymore, I can destroy it, and this, oh, I destroyed it in the prefab. I can destroy it from the real object. There you are. And nothing else breaks, it still continues to work. There we go. So the next problem I want to address is that explosions don't set themselves up. So this is the damageable class, and then when an object is damaged to the point that it is destroyed, it explodes. Now, there are three things that this class is doing, technically. It is managing some health. It is allowing damage to be taken. And if the health goes below 0, it is exploding. So it is allowing an object to be destroyed and ultimately turned off. So that's fine, but it assumes a couple of things. It assumes that other objects won't have health which in this case, I don't see that other objects will have health, so I'm not worried about that. Also, this isn't prohibitive in that it's possible to make an object have health and be damageable by giving it a damageable class. Unless there's a situation in which I want an object to have health but not be damageable, this is fine. However, I do want to be able to create explosions outside of things that are damageable. So I want to be able to create explosions where a projectile hits an object but doesn't destroy it, for example. So how am I going to do that? I need to basically remove this. Now, the way that I'm going to do this is that I'm going to go to the explosion object pool. So if you remember from the first module, this is a very basic object pool that is creating explosion objects. They are not specific to explosions, they're just objects. It's the same type of pool that is creating projectiles and asteroids. But what I want to do is I want to keep the pool element of this and extend it so that it can also set up an explosion using a pool object that it gets. So to do that, I'm going to create a new script called Explosion Manager. And I'm going to take off the object pool. And I'm going to open this up. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make this inherit from object pool. So the explosion manager is a type of object pool. So this now, if I go back into the inspector, does the same thing as it did. It's just called something else. So I'm going to add the explosion, and I think I had 10 on there. 10 will be fine. Right. So I'm going to add functionality to this to make it more specific to explosions. How am I going to do that? So first I need to go back to the object pool and I need to make some of these functions overridable. So I want to be able to use the awake function. So I'm going to make it protected and virtual. Now that doesn't change this function at all. So this will not break for other objects that are already using it, which is good. Going to go back to the explosion manager, and now I can override it and extend it. And here's why I want to do that. I want to be able to call explosions from anywhere without having a connection to it. So I want to have... I'm going to create a kind of singleton, but I'm going to do it in a slightly different way. So I'm going to have a singleton instance, a static instance, and I'm going to do the normal singleton thing, which is where in awake whoops, there we go. If instance is not equal to null and instance is not this, destroy this because it shouldn't exist, and return because destroying an object does not stop the rest of the function from executing. If that doesn't happen, set the instance to this, and then call the base awake function so that it does still get called. Okay, so it's a protected override void. So basically, whenever this function is called on this object, it will call this one, even if the calling script doesn't know that it is an explosion manager. Because if it is, the object pool will just pass it up to the overridden function. So, what's next? Now I want to create some public static functions. So, the reason that I want to do it this way around is I want to provide the functionality through functions and not necessarily through an instance. So normally with a singleton, you might do explosion manager dot instance dot whatever function you want to call. How I want to do it is I want explosion manager dot the function, and it just does it or not. The reason I want to do it this way is because if you go through the instance first, you either have a risk of it being null, or the calling script has to check to see if it is null, which is just extra overhead. I quite like this, doing it this way around, because it allows me to null check it. So if I do public static void generate explosion, and then I want a position for the explosion and a radius for the explosion, then I can check to see if there's an instance first. So if instance is null, learn to spell, there we go, then I just return out of it. Nothing happens. And maybe put a warning in. So debug log warning. No explosion manager exists in the scene. Okay, so if I've got this far, it does exist and we can carry on. And this is where I'm going to put the functionality that came from. Is that the same? It's slightly different. I'll just write it again. So, game object explosion equals instance get object. So this is taking the get object function from the instance of this, which is a type of object pool. So it's going down to object pool and it's doing this function which returns a pool object. In this case, an explosion. And it's setting a reference to it when I create it. And then I can just do explosion.transform.position equals position, and explosion.transform.local scale equals 1 vector 3.1 times radius, and then explosion.set active true, because if you remember the explosion objects, they work by just being turned on, and then they shrink and then they turn off. So you can't turn it on and then set the position, because from last time it would have been 0 and it'll just turn itself off again because it's already done. So you have to set it all up and then turn it on. So what do we need to do now? We need to remove the explosion references from other parts of the game. And the easiest way to do that is to go from where I know they're being called. So if I go into the game manager and I open this and I've got, okay, so I've got an explosion pool, not anymore. So I'm going to remove that and save. And then I'm just going to follow the errors to find which objects were accessing it. There's only one, which is the damageable script. And I can take all of this out except for the stuff that refers to turning off this object. And then instead of this, all I'm going to do is explosion manager generate explosion. And it's going to be transform.position and transform.local scale.x, and then save. So back in here, I'm going to see if this works. Come on, give me an asteroid. There we go. Yep. So wherever a damageable script is working, an explosion is being correctly generated. Okay, so now I can generate an explosion wherever I want, with a position and a radius. Now, if I wanted to have a basic explosion as well, I could create an override, a public static void generate explosion that just takes a position but nothing else. And then in the body, instead of copying all of this again, I can just call generate explosion, pass in the position, and pass in my own scale. Which would be handy if I also wanted a way to just create a basic explosion. I'm just going to take that out though, because even though I did put this in my notes, I realized that I never used it. So I'm going to close that. We can just take it out. So now I'm going to go to the projectile, and I'm going to call an explosion when the projectile hits. So this is the point in the logic where a projectile hits. I know it is because I can see where it's turned off and where it plays the hit clip. And I'm just going to do explosion manager transform.position transform.local scale.x. They're all the same. Ooh. Generate explosion. There we go. Type it properly. And then save. And then I'm going to test it. Now I have explosions when projectiles hit as well. So it's not a huge difference, but it was because of the way I changed the process of generating explosion. Now it doesn't have to be a damageable object. It can just be generated from anywhere quite easily. It's now very easy to change. So it's very easy for me to add that in. All of this video was just me setting up how to do it. The actual changing it part took 2 seconds. And that's how it's going to be with other features. If I want to make something else create an explosion, it's going to be very easy to do that. Okay, now I've got explosions popping off all over the place. It does cause one issue in that the explosion sound, which sits with the explosion prefab, now covers the hit sound. So I just need to change how that works to make it a little more appropriate. So now that an explosion isn't so closely tied with something being damageable, the sound of something being damaged to the point where it is destroyed needs to sit with the damageable class, not with the explosion. So I'm just going to take it out. I'm going to go to here. I'm just going to comment that out. Going to copy it, and I'm going to put it in here instead. Save that. And then we're going to go to the prefabs just to replace those sounds. So an asteroid is damageable. That needs an explosion sound. And a player is damageable. So that needs an explosion sound. Right. Just test that. So now it's just a little easier to change those sounds now that they're triggered from a relevant place. And it's just a case that because the relationship of the scripts has changed, the responsibility of who needs to have the sound has changed as well. Just a small thing, but it's just something to keep in mind when changing stuff in this way. everything we've done so far has been kind of a small change. However, now we're going to dig into something that affects more than one system, and it has more of a knock-on effect when it's changed. So I want to look at how projectiles are being managed, because at the moment, if you go into the weapon script, so the weapon is setting up the projectile, which is fine, but it's not really its responsibility. Plus, it limits a certain amount of things. So it limits, for example, the fact that the weapon must be a projectile. And when you start to look at this, you think, okay, well, I'll just take this out and put it in a different script. You start to realize it exposes some of the inflexibilities of the system as I have it now, in that when I'm using the weapon must be a projectile, and if it's not a projectile, then how else do you manage, how the projectile is generated? How do you pass the player number to it? How could you do that with a different system? And it raises a lot of other questions. This was probably one of the most difficult changes I made in this lesson, was working out how to do this in a responsible way. And this is what I settled on. So here's what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to separate what is a weapon from the script that controls a weapon. Then I'm going to differentiate between a type of weapon that fires a projectile as opposed to a different type of weapon, so that I can put the logic that is relevant to being a projectile in with the projectile type weapons, and the logic that is related to firing one of a number of different weapons, because I want to be able to have more than one weapon in a different script to this as well. So I'm separating it out between multiple systems now. This one class isn't going to cut it anymore. So here's how I'm going to do that. I'm going to go back in here. I'm going to create an empty object, and I'm just going to call it weapons. I'm going to go ahead and take off the weapon script from here, because we're not going to do it from here anymore. I'm going to do it from here. Now, I'm going to add a weapon controller script instead. So this is what's going to control a particular weapon. So this will receive the input event, and it will choose whichever weapon it is going to use, and then it will pass that event to the weapon it's using, as opposed to there just being one weapon that's constantly directly listening to the event. There's going to be a step in between. So here's how I'm going to do that. I'm going to have a serialized field. It's going to be an array of weapons. It's going to be called the weapon list. So before the weapon script was just one script that dealt with the firing of the weapon on the object. Now I'm changing what a weapon means, and I'll do this when I get to that script. Is now a weapon is an individual weapon that can be used by this weapon controller. So I'm going to use just an int for the current weapon, and that's just going to be passed into this to choose whichever weapon I've got enabled at the time. And I'm just going to create a function to select the weapon. This will be public, and it will take an int for the index. I don't want this to accidentally go over, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clamp it between 0 and weapon list dot length -1, because this will be inclusive, which wouldn't work. Oh, I've done it twice, that's why. Okay. Right, so in the awake function, I am going to populate the weapons list. So I don't want to have to drag these to the weapons list automatically, so I'm just going to get any component that's on this object. So I'm going to use get components for types of weapon. And then I'm going to have an onFire function. Remember, this needs to be called onFire for the input manager to call it. And then this will fire the weapon, but that's not going to work yet because that function doesn't exist. So I'm just going to put fire the weapon and hopefully remember to come back here to put that in. So I can save that now, and now I'm going to go back to the weapon script and change this. So, like I was saying, weapon is no longer a specific script. It's now just an abstract thing that defines a type of weapon, and it'll be up to individual classes that inherit from that to determine what that actually means. So with that in mind, I'm going to make the class abstract. I'm going to take most of this out because I don't need it now. So all I need is protected player. So this is a reference to the player script that this weapon belongs to, because remember, projectiles and weapons need to know the number of the player so they can pass that to the points object so that the points are attributed to the right player. And then I'm going to have a public string for the weapon name, because these are going to be listed, and then a protected virtual void awake, because I'll want to use awake in other functions. And then what this is going to do is it's just going to set up the player reference. Now, you could use getComponent, which would check the same object. You could use getComponent in parent, which would go up. You could use getComponent in children, which would go down. If you've got a hierarchy of objects and you're not worried about the performance and you just want to check all of them for an object, for a component even, then the easiest way to do that is to go back to the top and check down. So I can say player.transform.root.get component in children player. And then what that's going to do is it's going to go from here, it's going to find the root object, which is this one, and then it's going to call get component in children from this object, which will find this one. Get component in children searches the same object as it's called on as well. So if you've got this like prefab hierarchy and you just want to find it on any object, that's a guaranteed way to do it. I wouldn't call it regularly in case there are a lot of objects to search through, because it could potentially be slow. If you're doing it once, it doesn't matter. Now, I want to have a function that all weapons must have, and that is the fire function. So I'm going to make it public. I'm going to make it abstract because I don't want to define what it does here. Returns void. It's called fire, and it takes a transform, which is the object that's doing the firing, the origin, because that's going to be used in most cases. And that's it. So I've abstracted the weapon, and I've abstracted how the weapon is triggered. Now I need to create an abstraction between projectiles and other types of weapon that are not projectiles. So remember that the whole original objective of this, which is going to turn out to be quite a long step, was to remove the projectile setup from the weapon class. That still needs to happen somewhere, so it's going to need to happen in a projectile weapon, or more appropriately, it's going to need to happen in the object pool that generates the projectile in the first place. However, object pools are not specific enough to be able to do that, so we're going to create a projectile pool in the same way that I created an inherited version of an object pool. I'm going to create an inherited version of a projectile pool to manage just projectiles. This is not going to be created in the game manually ahead of time. This is going to be created as required. So I'm going to create the script in the project and not on an object. I'm going to call it projectile pool. And I'm going to have it inherit from object pool. Now, there are a few different things I'm going to have to do to make this work. So one of the first things I need to do is I'm going to create a public int called player number. So this object pool is not going to get the player number, but it needs to know it. So I'm going to set it when it's created. The projectile weapon will be doing the creating of this pool. So I'm going to hide it in the inspector because I don't need to see it in the inspector, but it does need to be public. I'm going to create a protected override game object function called create object. Now, immediately there's a problem with this because this create object function is from object pool, but it is not virtual, so it can't be overridden. So I need to go back. I need to make it protected and virtual. Now remember that this won't affect other classes that use this function as it is. It only applies if an inheriting class has an overridden version and is given that in place of an object pool. So I'm going to save that, go back to the projectile pool. And now the only error it's giving me is that it doesn't return an object because this has to return a game object. So now I'm basically going to call the base version first, but then do a few extra things with it. So I'm going to game object created object equals base dot create object. So that's going to call the normal function and return the object. So at the moment, this does the exact same thing as the function it's inheriting from. It's overriding even. Then I want to get the projectile script that's on that object and give it the player number. So I want to go if created object dot try get component out projectile. Whoops. Projectile player number. See, now this doesn't work either because this is currently private. So all I need to do is make that public. Then go back. Equals player number. And then I've done everything I need to do with this now, so I can just return created object. So this will happen anytime an object is created, which will be for the most part at the start, but then if enough objects don't exist, it'll be done every time a new object is created for it as well. And then I want a function to generate a projectile. And this is what the projectile weapon is going to use. So it's public void generate projectile. I'm going to need a vector3 position. I'm going to need a rotation. Now, if you remember, this is what was in the weapon script originally. So this is what I did before, which was new projectile equals get object. So it gets an object from the pool, new projectile transform.position equals position, new projectile transform rotation equals rotation, and then turn it on. So new projectile, set active true. And then it just does its thing on its own. Okay, so one more thing I need to do with this is that I need to be able to set the data of the object pool when I'm setting it up, and for that I need to add an extra function. So all I really need to do is I need to set the object, and I need to set the number to create. I don't really want to open these up so that they're public. Really, I just want like a constructor type function that I can call that will do that for me. Since this is something that other scripts might use with an object pool, I don't feel the need to put this in the inherited projectile pool. I think this can go straight into the original. Also, it needs to go in the original so that it can access these serialized fields that are private. So all I'm going to do is do public set pool. It takes a game object, which is the pool object, and a number to create. And then, like I would with a constructor, that needs to be void. Like I would with a constructor, I'm just going to go this pool object equals pool object. This number to create equals number to create. And that's it. And I'll use that later when I am setting up the projectile pool. So now I've got a weapon controller, and I've got a base type of weapon, and I've got a projectile pool. I need to put all that together with a projectile weapon. So I'm going to go to the weapon script. I'm going to add projectile weapon. And this is the new instance of a weapon. So this will inherit from weapon, and this will be something that the weapon controller can use, and something that will use a projectile pool, but it will need to create its own. I'm going to start with serialized field, game object, projectile. So this will be the prefab that actually gets used, and a projectile pool reference called projectiles. This is the pool of projectiles once it's generated that it will draw from. And then I'm going to put an offset like I had before, just a controllable distance from the object from which to create the projectiles. And before I forget, I need to inherit this from weapon. So you can see now that it is complaining that I don't implement the inherited abstract member fire. So let's put that in now. In fact, I can just right click, quick actions, implement, just delete that. And then I can go projectiles, generate projectile. Ooh, whoops. Origin.position plus origin.transform.up times offset. And then rotation. Okay, so that will fire from the projectile pool, but the projectile pool doesn't exist yet. We're not adding one to the scene, so we need to add one here. Here's how we're going to do that. Going to call a protected override void awake. And if you remember, the reason that it's protected override is because we already have an awake function. In weapon, we have awake, which is getting a reference to the player, so that we know what the player number is going to be. So it's going to call base awake first, and then it's going to do game object projectile container equals new, oh, there we go, equals new game object. So this will create a new game object, just an empty game object that we're going to use to store the projectiles. And I can give it a name here as well, so I'm going to call it projectile name plus pool. That'll do. Now, projectile container transform dot parent equals transform dot root. So the reason I'm doing this is I don't want the projectile container to be a child object of this object which is attached to the player. It will mean that the projectiles will rotate with the player, which isn't what I want for this type of weapon. So I'm going to move it back to the container, which never moves. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the projectile container off. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because awake isn't called on an object that's turned off. And I don't want awake to be called yet, because if you remember in the object pool is set up in awake. So I'm about to create a projectile pool, and then I want to set some of its data before it sets it up. So I don't want awake going off on it. So I'm turning off the container, and then I'm going to set it up, and then we're going to turn the container on again. So projectiles, because I want to get a reference to what I'm about to add, equals projectile container add component projectile pool, and then projectiles set pool. So I need an object, which is my projectile object, and I need a number, which I can pick, let's say 30. And then projectiles dot player number equals, remember that the weapon class holds a reference to the player, so I can just do player dot number. And now everything's ready, so I can turn the object on, and then its awake will be called, and then the pool will be set up. So I can go projectile container set active true. So back in Unity, I've got a few things to connect now. So here's my projectile weapon, and I want to add my projectile to it. I've just got a normal projectile. I'm going to change these in a moment. And I'm going to call it double shot, because it's a double shot. Double shot. And I'm not going to add it to the weapons list because I don't need to, because it does it automatically. I am going to leave that as it is. Then I'm going to remove the existing projectile pools so I make sure this is working. So I'm going to go back into the game manager. Here's a projectiles pool. I'm going to take that out. I'm going to go into the game manager script. And I'm going to take that out. Let's see if anything breaks. And it doesn't. And then before I do anything else, I need to change the execution order of one of these scripts. So a lot of this depends on the player number already being set, which is done in the player script in awake. So when the player is added, the awake function is called and it gets its player number. Now, before the weapon script was counting on that having already happened because it was doing its setup in start. Now that it's all happening in awake, there's a chance that one of them will happen in the wrong order. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change it to a 2-player game to demonstrate this, and I'm going to force the thing I don't want to happen, and then I'm going to fix it. So in project settings, script execution order, so I'm going to add player. And at the moment it happens after default time. So this will definitely happen after other awake functions, which is what I'm worried about happening. So this is the bad thing. So actually, is this even going to work? No, because I haven't set it up properly yet. I know why it's not working, because I forgot to go back to the weapon controller. I did this when I prepped this as well. I did the exact same thing, and I wrote it down and remembered to go back and do this, and I didn't do it. Weapon list, current weapon, dot fire, and then pass in a transform, which is this transform, save. Now this will work. Wonderful. Okay, now where were we? Right, so I've got 2 players here, and I'm going to have player 2 score some points. But they've been added to player 1's total because he never got his player number in time. That's because it was set before the player actually got his number. So all I need to do is go back to the script execution order and just move this. Anything before default time is enough. So just doing that, it doesn't need to happen before these other scripts. I can probably put it with Audio Manager because I do believe that was me as well. And just apply it. And then now this will work. So make sure red gets these points. And they do. There we go. So why did I go to all that trouble with the projectiles just to have something that works in fundamentally the same way? Well, again, it's so that I can change it easily. So now, because the trigger for a weapon is abstracted, the definition of what a weapon is abstracted, and the specific implementation of a weapon that fires projectiles is abstracted, I can create a different type of weapon that doesn't fire projectiles easily without affecting the trigger or the definition of what it is, so that the trigger works universally with it. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to make 2 new weapons. I'm going to make a different type of projectile, and then I'm going to make a weapon that isn't a projectile at all. So before I had these 2 types of prefab, I'm just going to change them to, what have we got? We've got projectile double. Then I'm going to delete this one. And I'm going to create, I could create a variant actually here. Let's make a single instead. And I'm going to change the sprite. And I'm going to change the damage. And then on the double, I'm going to change the speed so it does more damage but it's slower. And then on the player, in the weapons, this is all I need to do to create a second weapon. Like a projectile weapon. I'm going to drag it to the top because I want it to be the first one now. I'm going to call it single shot. I'm going to set the game object, and I'm done. So now this should be a single shot, which it is. And if I go into one of the players, change their current weapon to index 1, it should now be a double shot for them. I'll save the red. And that's it. And rinse and repeat. I can do that as many times as I like. It also means, because weapon is an abstract concept. Now, I can create something that works in a completely different way, and all it needs to do to be considered a weapon is have the on fire, or the fire, sorry, function, so that that can definitely be called. So we can, for example, make a laser. So I'm going to go back into the player container. First, I'm going to make a quick laser beam in the display. I'm going to add a sprite. And it's just going to be it's skinny, push it up to there, and I'm going to make it transparent because I don't want it to be visible. And I'm going to add the fade sprite script to this with a speed of 10 and drag the renderer. Because what I want to do is I want to turn this on and then have it fade out when it's fired. And that's going to do that. So we're reusing this script. Now, back to the weapons. So I'm going to add a laser weapon. Take this out, and it's going to inherit from weapon, so that can be considered a type of weapon. Now, there are a couple of things I'm going to add to this. So just like with the movement script, I want to use a Unity event to trigger the laser beam. So I'm going to just add that first so I don't forget. So Unity engine, whoopsie, dot events. It's going to be serialized field, Unity event on laser fire. And then float damage equals 10. So this is the data that would normally be in the projectile, but we're just putting it in here because there are no projectiles. Still going to have an offset because there's still going to be a detection area. Have audio clips for when it's fired. And again, because there are no projectiles, the projectile can't report when it's hit. So this will instead, so hit clip. And then I'm going to implement the fire function. So public override void called fire, and it takes a transform. Now there are a couple of things I need to do to satisfy the requirements of the raycast that I'm going to do. So raycast 2D typically needs a set of filters to filter out objects you don't want to hit. In 3D, you use layer masks. In 2D, it's contact filters, which are actually a lot better than layer masks. You can use quite a lot of different options. I'm not going to use one though, so I'm just going to create a contact filter so that I can use the no filter function and just ignore it. So that's what this is here. So contact filter 2D, filter equals new. Wait, this is a struct, isn't it? Yeah, it's a struct. And then raycast hit 2D. Hit colliders. Actually, I'm going to put this in here because that I don't want to have them in there. I'm going to put them in here instead. Okay, and then this works in a similar way, I believe, to raycast non-allocating version of raycast, where it returns a number. So num hit equals physics 2D raycast, and then that takes an origin. So that will be origin.position plus origin.up times offset. And then the direction will be origin up. And then this version of it takes the contact filter next, so I can just do filter no filter because I don't want to use it. And then I get my results, and I can put my results into hit colliders. So hit colliders. So at this point, the laser has been fired. So whether it hits something or not, I need to invoke the laser event. So on laser fire dot invoke, and I'm going to play the sound. So audio manager. Oh, I can't spell. Instance dot play sound effects fire clip. Okay, so next I want to, like the projectile, I want to detect if I've hit something. So I'm just going to go to projectile, and I'm going to copy this, and I am going to see what I need to change from it. So if number hit is greater than 0, if hit colliders collider, then it damages it, tries to get the points, and it will pass in the points value. I need to change that to player.number, because remember, this object has a reference to its player number in its base class. And then I want to generate an explosion, but I want it to happen at the point of impact. So that would be hit colliders i.point, and I'm just going to manually give it a scale 0.2. I'm going to play the hit clip. I don't need to turn anything off, and then that breaks the for loop. Okay. So then in the Unity event, actually let's call it a laser. I'm going to create the Unity event. I'm going to create two. I'm going to drag the laser beam to both of them, because what I want to do is I want to simultaneously set the target as 0, and I want to set the value to be 1. Let's see if this works. I'm going to go back to single player. So we need to select the right weapon. So player 1. Oh no, that's the canvas. Player container. Weapons. So I want weapon 2. So it's working, but I'm not getting the fire clip at the moment. Probably because I haven't set it. And yeah, I haven't set the fire clip or the hit clip. So the fire clip is shot. Hit clip is impact. And now it should work. And now I have a laser. Now, I quickly want to write a script that allows me to test that. I'm just going to copy it across though. So I'm going to go to the weapon controller, going to add a script called weapon tester. And I'm just going to paste this in because it's not really super tricky stuff. It's a reference to the weapon controller. It gets it in awake, and then if I press 1, 2, or 3 using the old input manager commands, because it's just a test script, it will select the weapon. Just because I want to be able to easily select which weapon I'm using, just for the purpose of demonstration. So I've got my single shot. Why hasn't that worked? Oh, because I didn't actually set the current weapon in this function. Silly me. So, in the select weapon function when I wrote it earlier on, I'm not sure why, but I forgot to actually set the current weapon index. So, current weapon equals index. Now this will work. Single shot, double shot, laser. Wonderful. Now, parts of this work in a similar way to the projectile logic, like points. But there's a problem with that in that we shouldn't really be updating points in the weapon. We should just be managing the weapon. So we're going to move that logic to the point script instead. So the way I'm going to do that is that the damageable component is going to hold an override for when it's being damaged by another player. So it's going to be able to pass its player number to the damageable script. And then that's going to raise an event, a Unity event, to say, I've been destroyed by this player. Then the point script can use that if it wants to score the points, as opposed to doing it this way around, where we're accessing two systems directly from one script. Really, that would make it a bit tricky to untangle, because really we just want any kind of projectile, any kind of weapon to just inflict damage and pass data about itself to the thing it's damaging, and that's it. That's all we want it to do. So I'm going to go into the damageable script, and I'm going to create another version of damage. Called public bool damage. Takes a damage amount like before, but also an attacking player number. This only applies if the object is actually destroyed, and the damage function normally returns a true or false depending on whether or not it's been destroyed. So we don't have to reuse this. We can just put additional logic if that turned out to be true. So I'm going to create a Unity event, so using Unity engine.events. Actually, put it at the bottom. Serialize field, Unity event int on destroyed by player. So then all this override is going to do is it's going to call the normal damage function. It's going to go if damage, passing in the damage amount, equals true. So that means this will still execute. This will pass the damage, and it will return true if it was destroyed. So if this happens, then if the object was destroyed, raise the event. So on destroyed by player, invoke, and then pass the attacking player number. We still have to return true or false because it's an override of that. So we need to return true because it was destroyed, or return false because if we got to here, it wasn't destroyed. So now I'm going to go to the projectile script, and I am going to remove this points logic because we don't need it anymore. In fact, we don't even need to know if the object was destroyed anymore. We can just call the function and leave everything else as it is. So damageable dot damage, pass the damage amount, and pass player number. Save that. I'm going to do the same thing in laser weapon. So remove everything. So remove the points code and the check to see if it was actually destroyed, and instead call damageable, and in this case it's player dot number because I'm using the base member. Save those. So now we need a way of scoring the points. So I'm going to go into the point script. So this no longer holds a points value that's red. Instead, it's got base points, and it's going to have an option for scaling points by size. I'm going to default that to true. And then there's going to be a public function called score points that takes a player number. So you're going to take points equals base points, and then if scale points by size, I'm going to take this code and change points to base points times by the size. And then after all that, game manager instance update score points player number. So now all of it happens in the point script. It's not connected though, so I just need to go back to the only object that scores points, which is the asteroid, and in the Unity event I just need to drag the points object to it and score points. So why am I using a Unity event and not something else? The reason that I like a Unity event for this, as opposed to, say, getting a direct connection, so having points look for damageable or having damageable look for points, is one, it's abstracted, but two, it's not any bigger than it needs to be. So it's a nice, easy manual connection to create between the two scripts. It doesn't need to be global. There's no static event. You could abstract it in other ways, but this is generally the simplest way to do it. So again, do it however you want to, but that's why I've used a Unity event in this example, just because it's an easy local connection to manage. If I ended up getting sick of making multiple Unity events and connecting them all up, I'd find a different way to do it. But because it's just this one thing, it's really not a problem. So let's test that that's all working. So we need to see some points on the board. Yep, works for that. Let's try with a laser. Works for that as well. And let's try for a two-player game, just to make sure that it is working correctly and it's passing the right number through. Lasers. Let's get red to score some points. Which they have. So that's all working. Okay, so the last thing that I want to fix is that the game manager is managing the UI, which isn't really appropriate since the UI now relies on the game manager existing. Now, you could say, well, the UI gets all its information from the game manager anyway, but it means that the game manager, the UI, so if you remove the game manager, that immediately breaks. If you remove the UI, it breaks, and it's just two coupled together. So I want to instead have the game manager just manage the game and have the UI respond in turn. So there are two things I need to do that. First, I'm going to create a new definition for a player using a scriptable object data type. And two, I'm going to break the reference to the player UI so that I can follow it back to the systems that are calling it and change how they work. I'm going to start by creating the scriptable object. So I'm going to go into scripts. I'm going to create this in, where should I create this? I'm going to create a new folder for this. So I'm going to create a player profiles folder. While I'm here, I'm just going to tidy up a bit because this has gotten quite messy. Here we go. Then in that folder, I'm going to create a C# script, which I'm going to call player profile. Open that up. Right, so this is going to be a scriptable object. So scriptable object, which means I need the create asset menu. Where did that fail? Attribute, so that I can actually make it. So these all need to be public. I want a public game object. This is going to be the player object. Public color, the player color. Can't do it. It needs to be, there we go. A public string player name. I'm not going to have a player number in here because the player number is assigned to a player when they're created, and it's used in the game manager to differentiate between the first player that was created and the second player that was created. So it's not something that exists as part of the player profile. It's not, adding it here would just cause confusion. So this is all that it is. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to go back to the project. I'm going to create two player profiles. Create a player profile, player 1. And I'm just going to duplicate that. Player 2. There we go. Right, let's set that data. So I need to go to the game manager. I need to find the colors that I had. I'm going to copy that and just paste it. And I'm going to use the player container prefab for both. Player 1 and player 2. I'm not sure that I actually use these player names in the example, but this would be a good place to keep something like this because it's not like you can the numbered equivalent when you want it written as text like this. So it's just, if you want to give it a name, this would just be a good place to do it. Now, I'm going to go back to the game manager and I'm going to break it. So I'm going to comment out the player UI. And I'm also going to comment out anything that is to do with the player UI. I'm just going to comment it, not delete it, because I want to be able to go back through and replace what I've disabled with a new event. So player UI, comment that out, comment that out, and comment that out. And what else have we got? Windscreens, they're going to be part of the UI as well, even though They're not directly related, so let's take those out. I'll take them out here. What else aren't we using now? So we're not setting the colors here, so take that out. We're not setting the player object here, so take that out. We will keep the scores because that's part of managing the game. And now I'm just going to have to go through and fix all the stuff I've broken. So these are now broken, not commented, because I've changed how I am managing players. So what I need is an array of player profiles. So instead of having this separated data, player object, player colors, windscreens, I now have an array of player profiles. I'm just going to call it players. So now, wherever I would have used this local data, I'm going to use the scriptable object instead. So instead of that, I'm going to instantiate players I dot player object. Players I dot color. What else is broken? Nothing. That could be it. Okay. Players. 2 players. Player 1. Player 2. Okay, so what we should now have is a working game but no UI. Which we do. Okay, so now what I need to do is I need to create events that the UI system can hook into. So I'm going to add some events. I need to do using system. Now, because I've added system, this is going to break a couple of things. Random it's a class that exists in system and it also exists in Unity Engine. So if you have both, it doesn't know which one it should be using. So I'm just going to go with Unity Engine .random. Just before I do anything else. Okay, now I can make my events. So I'm going to put all these at the top. I want public static event action that takes a type of player profile. I'm going to copy that because I'm going to be using it a lot. On player created. Same again, except it takes a player profile and an integer. This is going to be on player killed. The integer in this one is so I can pass how many lives the player has remaining. So the next one is again an event action with player profile and an integer on score changed. So this is the player whose score has changed and their score. And one more is just a player profile this time. It's going to be on player win. So a player has won the game and this is the winning player. Now I'm going to go through these commented out sections and just raise those events. So for example, so here is where we're setting up the player because we've created them. So I'm just going to take that out and say on player created invoke. And then we are in a for loop here, so we're just going to pass I into players. So players I. Then when the win screens would have been displayed, we'll just say that one of the players has won. So on player win, invoke players, winning player. So this is where a player has been killed. So I'm just going to replace that with on player killed, invoke, and this has a player number this time, so we're going to go with players player number, and the integer is lives. And then finally, in the update score function, I'm going to call the on score changed event invoke, again pass players player number and scores player number, and save that. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to check for errors, but nothing should actually work yet. So it should not work, but also not break. So players created, points, killed, nothing going wrong. Okay. So now I need to go into the UI systems and have them read those events. So I'm going to go to the canvas, which is where my UI is. And I'm going to turn the UI objects on. So before, these were being enabled by the game manager when they were needed. I'm not going to do it that way. Instead, I'm going to turn them on from here. The reason I'm going to do that is because usually you'd subscribe to events in on enable and on disable, and that works great until the event requires you to turn the object on and off, and then it becomes a bit tricky because you have to find a place to subscribe to it and find a place to unsubscribe to it. And sometimes you can do this in awake or start and on destroy, but it's less clean and less easy than in on enable and on disable. So instead, these are going to be on permanently, and I'm just going to manage their status, the status of the actual elements, which I can still turn on and off. So in the player UI script, so there's a few things I need to change here. So firstly, I need to create a reference to a type of player profile, which is this player's UI. Now, because they're assets, they can both point to the same thing. So this UI can point to the same asset that the game manager does, and we know we're talking about the same thing. So when that's passed in an event, all it needs to do is see if it matches this reference, or this asset even. I'm also going to create a reference to an image for the windscreen, because that's going to be managed from here now, not the game manager. And now I need to create some functions that hook into the events. So the first event I'm going to need to connect to is the player created event, which passes a player profile. So I need to create a setup UI event. So void setup UI event, and it's going to need to take a player profile. There we go. So because these are global events, there is a chance that they will be called, or not a chance, they definitely will be called at times when they're not relevant to this particular UI. And why you wouldn't want to do that with everything, you wouldn't want everything checking against themselves to see if they need to be using something. In this case, it's a 1:2 ratio, so it's okay. It's going to broadcast it to two objects. They're both going to check to see if it's their player that's being talked about, and if it is, they're going to set up their own UI. If it's not, they're not going to do anything else. And this is where we're going to check for that. So if player profile is not equal to my player, then just return. Otherwise, set player color, player profile dot player color, and then we need to activate the UI. So this is not a function that exists yet, so I'm just going to have to write it, which is void activate UI bool active. So when the UI is activated, the lives display game object is enabled. Set active active. And the score display game object is also enabled. So it'll match whatever's passed into this function. So then when the UI is set up, we can activate it. Essentially doing the same thing as turning it on, except its container object, if you like, is already on. Okay. So in the set player color function, I just need to also add windscreen.color equals player color. I didn't do that before. There we go. So now it will set up the lives display color, the score color, and the windscreen color. Next, I need to subscribe to the onPlayerKilled event. So we've got the update lives function that already exists, but it doesn't have the right signature. It takes a lives value, but it needs to also take a player profile. So I'm going to change that to player profile. And again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this check just to make sure that the player that's being talked about is the same as my player. Finally, I need a function to display the windscreen if this player has won. So I'm just going to add a function for that. I'm just going to put it in here. So it's going to be void display windscreen player profile, and I'm going to do the same check again. Whoops. Where I'm checking if this player is my player, and if it is, windscreen game object set active true. So now I have functions to respond to all of these events, but I'm not actually subscribed to the events. So if you remember back to the events and delegates lesson, what I need to do is put these in on enable and on disable. So the first thing I want to do with this object is disable the UI if it's not actually being used. So this will deactivate it by default, meaning that the setup UI function needs to be called to actually turn it on. So it will disappear and then it will come back if it is actually being used. I'm also going to add game manager dot on player created plus equals. So I need to connect the events to their corresponding functions. So set up UI, game manager on score changed plus equals update score. Now, why hasn't that worked? No overload matches delegate pattern. Because I haven't done this. This hasn't got the right pattern. So I need to do that and do the same thing again. There we go. And now it works. Because it had the wrong parameters, it wouldn't do it. And game manager on player killed plus equals update lives game manager on player win plus equals display windscreen. And then to unsubscribe from all of those, all I need to do is just do that. I'm just going to minus, minus, minus. I need to go back to the objects and connect up some of those references. So we've got, in player 1, we need the windscreen. We need the player profile. Player 2, we need the windscreen, and we need the player profile. And that should be everything we need to do. So let's test it. I've got 2 player games, so I want to see that both players are working. Points are working for both players. What about lives? Come on, where's an asteroid when I need one? There we go. Lives are working. Let's see about the windscreen. There we go. So, is this a better way to do things? Well, define better. Better means different things to different people in different situations, but generally speaking, there are some characteristics of better code that will apply to most people, such as it being easy to rework as the requirements of your game change, and being simple enough that when you've been away from your project for a while, it's easy to pick up where you left off. This is because the biggest threat to the performance of your game is not being able to finish it. So keep it simple, do it in a way that you enjoy, and when you're stuck, use the lessons of this module to help you to decide what to do next.